So I'm going to just jump right in. This is a picture of a border wall in South Texas near the Mexican border. And what originally drew me to this research actually was a National Public Radio episode looking at birth tourism. And the journalist had highlighted where McMansions in the wealthy suburbs of Los Angeles had been converted from, say, a seven bedroom, 7-bath to 17 bedroom and 17 bath to accommodate wealthy Asian women coming to give birth in the US and then convalesce afterwards. And what really sparked my interest was that the way these residences were discovered was because of building code violations. And that was interesting to me because I had been working, previously on building code changes in various states in the United States where they were being used to shut down abortion clinics. So I was working with lawyers to create diagrams for them to be able to argue in front of the courts why these building code changes were not improving health and safety. So the building code issues around these birthing houses became very interesting. So this project considers what role space participates in for those seeking to cross nation-state borders to primarily enter into the United States, but also to make their way into Canada. The research examines how space is legally defined and how the needs of those who enter, both legally and illegally, are provided for. The project foregrounds a diversity of subjects, such as migrants and asylum seekers and their personal spatial experiences, ones whose voices are often ignored or overlooked, requiring architecture to engage in contemporary politicized spatial relationships. More broadly, the project focuses on both birthing spaces and spaces of refuge, how and if these services are advertised, citizenship laws and policies used to either allow or obstruct legal rights, the role of borders and identities of nation states as a mechanism to disempower, in ways women, parents with children, and unaccompanied minors are using their bodies as a direct means to provide a different future for their children and themselves through transgressing actual space. This is allowed, it's legal within the construct of our United States Constitution, where the 14th Amendment states that all persons born are citizens of the United States and wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens, and they have equal protection of the laws. So therefore, it is legal for foreigners to arrive in this country pregnant and give birth so that their children will have American citizenship. Commonly referred to as birthright citizenship, this legal right was an important beginning point for this project. Initially, a focus of this research was to examine birthing centers solely dedicated to these women. The project began as one interested, as I'd mentioned, for pregnant women coming from Asia and and more impoverished women from Central America coming to the US for different yet related regions. Initially drawn to spaces to created women to do this, from retrofitted McMansions embedded within these residential neighborhoods for more affluent women to post-industrial landscapes right across the US-Mexican border for economically disadvantaged Mexican and Central American women. These underwhelming spaces are often, but not always, hidden, even camouflaged within their built environments. Early research revealed intersections between the production of space and reproduction in ways architecture was enabling such practices to occur. However, as the political situation in the United States continues to further destabilize, with border policies and their respective geographies frequently changing, combined with research trips to the border states of Texas, Arizona, and New York, it became apparent that the original and singular focus on pregnant women had to be reconsidered. It has become imperative to expand the focus to include parents and their children and unaccompanied minors who are crossing into as well as out of the United States, because to exclude those groups would portray a much narrower spatial landscape. Although the public almost exclusively hears about those seeking to enter the country, there are those who are desperate to try and leave, offering a counter-narrative to mainstream messaging. The project has evolved to engage these complexities and diversities of migration and the space being created to support these geopolitical mobilities. As the research is still in its nascent phase, the primary focus is revealing the structures and hierarchies of power at work that enable governments, political entities, as well as responses by NGOs and religiously affiliated organizations to construct the narratives the public receives. The role between and among these political actors is crucial to understand the larger influences and stakeholders at a variety of scales and be able to imagine potentials of what sorts of changes are possible. As we witness how the US government is handling thousands of adults and children who continue to cross into the US, these actions must be contextualized within globalization, labor and capital accumulation, the postmodern economy, and the neoliberal state. Those most impoverished are most impacted by what many argue are unlawful policies and human rights abuses. Sylvia Frederiki's work on labor, capital accumulation, globalization, and these effects on women, both historically and contemporarily, provides an important lens through which to think about Latin American migrants who risk everything to make their way into the United States. Often, they are either quite impoverished or fleeing extreme violence and life-threatening situations. In either case, they bear some of the greatest effects of these economic policies Fredriki discusses. In her seminal book, Caliban and the Witch Women, The Body and Primitive Accumulation, she provides an historical analysis of how the change from feudalism to capitalism disproportionately affected women. Citing Mara Risa Dalla Costa and Selma James' work, where they argue that the exploitation of women has played a central function in the process of capitalist accumulation, insofar as women have been the producers and reproducers of the most essential capitalist commodity, labor power. Fredriki traces women's disempowerment that took place as life became ever more commercialized. Through this process, where labor moved from providing familial subsistence through farming to labor performed for monetary pay, women's access to property and income became severely reduced. Primitive accumulation refers to Marx's idea about the social and economic restructuring in response to the difficulties that the feudal economy was experiencing by the late Middle Ages. Fredriki argues that Marx excludes any discussion of the impact capitalism had on the reproduction of labor power and the social positions of women. One of her critical points of analysis of primitive accumulation is that it was far more than about exploitable workers and capital. It was also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, whereby hierarchies built upon gender as well as race and age become constitutive of class rule and the formation of the modern proletariat. The worker was not liberated, but rather capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, planted deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. This is relevant in regard to the influx of thousands of Central Americans and Mexicans entering into the US, because as we know, exploitation continues today in what Fredriki refers to as this new phase of globalization. Globalization has produced, according to Fredriki, the feminization of poverty, and through this economic restructuring, women's material conditions have been drastically reduced. This has led to a new colonial order. Women across the world are being integrated in the world economy as producers of workers, not only for the local economies, but for the industrialized countries as well, in addition to producing cheap commodities for global export. Thinking through these extreme conditions this produces, in Gore Capitalism, Sayak Valencia develops discourses that nurture a trans feminism that confronts and questions our contemporary situation, a situation that is invariably circumscribed by logic of Gore capitalism. Hoping to expand upon the current border possibilities, Valencia joins Judith Butler in arguing that it seems more crucial than ever to disengage feminism from its first world presumption and to use the resources of feminist theory and activism to rethink the meaning of the tie, the bond, the alliance, the relations that are imagined and lived in the horizon of a counter-imperialist egalitarianism. They propose the term war capitalism in the reinterpretation of the hegemonic global economy in geographic border spaces. Taking the term from the film genre, they argue this is the price the thoroughbred pays for adhering to the increasingly demanding logic of capitalism. It is because of the structures and processes integral to globalization and neoliberalism that produce more vulnerable bodies that become mutilated and desecrated.
huge.
Another aspect to these spatial and economic complexities is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or known as NAFTA. Created to encourage economic activity among the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, it was signed into law in 93 and went into effect in 94, phasing out tariffs on most trade between the three countries until January 2008. NAFTA created the world's largest free trade area. Although foreign investment and overall trade significantly increased, it did not create jobs or development, and this created large differences in the number of jobs available compared with the number of people seeking work. With the flaming of xenophobia by the Trump administration, fears within certain demographics of white America have escalated, creating negative perceptions of the border and those trying to cross from the south. Someone's audio.
Yes, Jeremy, your mic is on. Can you please mute it? Thank you. It's the difficulty.
Sorry. Okay. The Border Patrol has become ever more militarized by both the government and vigilantes. Renowned Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa writes about the historical border relations between Mexico and the United States. There's been a long relationship between the two countries that moves between peaceful and productive intersections to ones of war and pillage. As she writes, the hunters in army green uniforms stalk and track these economic refugees by the powerful night vision of electronic sensing devices planted in the ground or mounted on Border Patrol vans. Anthropologist Jason DeLeon argues that the terrible conditions faced by those trying to enter the U.S. are not arbitrary, but rather a federal plan, prevention through deterrence, that seeks to kill by forcing migrants to trek through the Sonoran Desert. The goal is to render invisible the innumerable consequences this socio-political phenomenon has for the lives and bodies of undocumented people. Although the current government spreads fear about our open borders, several theorists argue otherwise. The border region or space of the margins are critical locations that hold potent potential. Bell Hook's writing provides important ways to think about the border, migration, and space as a possibility. In her work, she discusses Black Americans' experiences where many Blacks occupy the margins rather than the center due to structural inequalities. She provides insights into ways to think about the positionality of migrants and their occupation at the margins, both within and between the U.S.-Mexico border regions. For her, the act of moving requires one to confront the realities and choices of location. She writes, within complex and ever-shifting realms of power relations, do we position ourselves on the side of colonizing mentality? Or do we continue to stand in political resistance with the oppressed, ready to offer our ways of seeing and theorizing, of making culture towards that revolutionary effort which seeks to create spaces where there is unlimited access to the pleasure and power of knowing, where transformation is possible? This choice is crucial. It shapes and determines our response to existing cultural practice and our capacity to envision new, alternative, oppositional aesthetic acts. It informs the way we speak about these issues, the language we choose. So part of this research also is looking at the history of immigration policies in the United States, as well as looking at the ways technology is being used and co-opted, both from the military and from the private sector. So things like ankle monitoring bracelets, surveillance towers, facial recognition software, biometric scanning, and most recently a plan to collect DNA from detained immigrants, which is incredibly illegal, but it's something that the administration has been disseminating publicly. So I want to transition just briefly and show two sites that I have interviewed and actually done some work for as a result of going on ground and meeting with people. So the first is the Holy Family Birth Center outside of McAllen, Texas, around 45 minutes. And it's in the middle of what was historically farmland. And it was begun by 4 nuns because they had been, who are also nurses, and they had been providing medical care for farmhands and migrant workers, and realized through the years that they were doing this that there was a need for pregnant women to have access to care. So they gradually over time created this birth center building by building. And I had the opportunity to interview one of the primary nuns who was the main organizer. And she was very clear that these buildings, completely insignificant, were never intended to be permanent. They're made out of wood construction. She imagined that as the need would hopefully there would be less need, so the buildings could be deconstructed and reconstructed elsewhere so that they would be more mobile. But in fact, since the 80s, the buildings and the complex has continued to survive and be used. So I was interested in understanding the ways that they have built their practice and who they serve. In this image, there's birthing cabins on either side around a very lush interior garden, and the idea was that pregnant women would walk while in labor around and around this courtyard until they were able to then deliver. And then because this is so remote, if you work there, you live there. So over time, they built a collection of buildings. So what you're looking in the middle of this image is the dining porch, and there's a kitchen to the right of it. And then in this image to the far left are living like dorm facilities. In the center is a very small chapel, and then there's medical offices and rooms to the right. And they were really kind of back to the earth project where they were growing most of the things they ate. They would swap services with local builders and contractors, and then they built some of them of the projects themselves. As it turned out, while I was there, they were wanting to do a renovation of their medical office suite. And so I really tried to find a local architect to work with them. And after months went by, I couldn't find anyone to do something pro bono. So I offered, a couple of schemes for them to build with a contractor, totally not intended, but wanted to help them as much as I could. And the second place that I wanted to highlight is Sacred Heart Catholic Church, which is located in McAllen, Texas. And this began with one nun's effort to provide day care for those coming immediately out of detention and on their way to their host family across the U.S. So it originally started in the dining hall of this Catholic church. They began to collect clothing. Their sister Norma, you see in the very back in black, she's the mastermind behind this and an enormous force. There was a very small medical space and a closet that got created. There were showers in their parking lot. There were air-conditioned tent units so that you could either have a rest or you could actually spend the night if the bus ticket wasn't until later. They have helped thousands and thousands of people and migrants recently released from detention. And as a result, they were asked to move their facility because there were so many people coming through their space. So they moved downtown to what was a former disco, and they have used this space up until the end of last summer, where everything was thrown into flux because the current administration is requiring migrants now to stay in Mexico while they're seeking asylum. But my husband went and volunteered last summer because we wanted to do something. And so we ended up helping organize this 8,000 square foot facility for donations and creating some sort of order among all of it. And I will say one of the things, working in a 90-degree metal building for a week, it made me really think about the kind of excess of my country and how people are willing to help through Amazon Prime and a click to donate. But there's not a lot of consideration of what that impact means on the other side, or if it even causes more challenges. So, we had thousands and thousands of pairs of diapers, and, will these ever be used? I'm not sure. It's not to negate people's desire and willingness to help, but to think about the kind of structural needs of what this excess of material and capital has in the US, and how does it actually get disseminated to those who need it most. And creating some sort of organization so they could help disseminate with those who are waiting downstairs for food and clothing and showers and just becoming cleaner. I also was helping them try to think of strategies to make something a bit more organized and trying to get donations of industrial shelving. So one of the things this research has led me to do, which was never intended, was to become more action-oriented on the ground. So it's not that, you know, I seek to do these projects, but at a point where you're engaging with these local communities and you see a need that architecture or the design fields can meet, I feel compelled and ethically committed to doing so. So this is where the project is right now, and I'm in the process of doing a lot more writing and synthesizing of all the different site visits. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for sharing this. So we've only got about 5 minutes left, but I have many questions, but I think I will open it up to the floor to see if anyone else has any. I think we could probably take two or three questions, if that's okay.
I'm not sharing anymore. Okay, good.
I think it brings up so many very pertinent issues that are perhaps even more pertinent with COVID-19, the closing of so many borders globally, and what it means for this kind of what you've referred to as the feminization of poverty and the inability to move of people, as well as this big question of ethics and architecture.
Yeah, and I've been wondering what they're doing now. I've been in touch a few weeks ago, but then haven't heard anything. So I'm not even sure if they're still open during this pandemic, which raises lots of issues about how people are seeking basic services, food, and minimal shelter.